Prime Minister Narendra Modi in Singapore, finishing the second leg of his 3-day tour of Southeast Asia. He was in Brunei earlier today. Of course, he's been there. He was there for just about yesterday as well as some part of today. And today, of course, he's in Singapore. Tomorrow as well, he'll be in Singapore having meetings with some of the top leaderships of both countries. So, joining us now to explain what exactly has been happening with India's outreach to Southeast Asia, why Prime Minister Narendra Modi has undertaken this visit to Brunei as well as to Singapore, is Dr. Premesha Saha of the Observer Research Foundation, someone who covers strategic issues very closely, especially when it comes to Southeast Asia. Dr. Saha, thank you so much for joining us. Could you tell us a little bit about these two countries, Brunei, Singapore? How exactly do they fit into India's broader strategic vision? Why exactly would the Prime Minister undertake this visit? Of course, it's Brunei, one of the first prime ministers ever to have undertaken this bilateral visit. Why do these countries matter in India's broader strategic compass?
Thank you, Shashank, for the questions. And to start with Brunei, you're right. He's the very first prime minister to have visited Brunei. And I think because given Brunei's size and given that it's a landlocked country, probably in the past, the importance of Brunei was not realized as much. Brunei is also one of the countries like Cambodia and Laos who is economically extremely dependent on China. In spite of having a territorial dispute in the South China Sea with China, its economic relationship with China has gone strong. I think if we go into the reports by the MEA or the transcripts from the MEA with regards to PM Modi's comments, think here the things like India believes in development, not expansionism. And he also commented on UNCLOS and how important international law is. In a way, trying to show that India can be a more trustable partner if we are looking at economic cooperation or even infrastructure developments in Brunei, because countries like Brunei, even Cambodia, Laos, they are in need of infrastructure development. So I think right now that is an area which India has to tap into if really they want Brunei to have a strategic or even an elevated relationship with India. That is one of the important areas that they need to look into. Second, obviously, would be maritime security cooperation. These countries have very limited naval capacities. So at least capacity building and training to help them patrol or even monitor the exclusive economic zones would be an important area also where India should look into. So with regards to Brunei, I think these are the important things. And also we have to keep this in mind that when we are talking about ASEAN goes on by consensus approach. So keeping good relations with all the 10 member countries and now with an 11th member who is going to get added, East Timor, it's important to keep a healthy relationship with all the 11 countries if you want to have an influence and standing within the ASEAN or even in the ASEAN-led platforms. So I think that's why Brunei is important. Coming to Singapore, Singapore is officially, at least till this year, the India coordinator in the ASEAN, at ASEAN. This will be taken over by Philippines later at the end of the year. But with Singapore, I think the relationship has focused a lot on FDIs, on trade and investment, given it is our largest trading partner within the ASEAN. Also, infrastructure, manufacturing, technology, especially digital payments. Singapore has an agreement with India's UPI, for example. Right. Food security has been very important for Singapore. So I think with Singapore, the relations has been such as when we talk of defense and security, the India-Singapore naval exercise has existed. But at the same time, I think what we need to look at with Singapore is also the fact that Singapore is an island nation. Singapore's port is, the busiest port in Southeast Asia. Looking at connectivity initiatives with Singapore would also be another step, another area that we should tap into. Singapore has kept a very neutral approach when we talk about the China's rise, or even with regards to South China Sea disputes in Southeast Asia. But at the same time, this is an important country. This is a country with which I think India stepped into its relation or stepped into its policy when we look at Southeast Asia. This was one of the first countries which formed a part of India's Look East policy. So that way, Singapore is a very trusted partner for India. And right now, given that there is a new government in place in Singapore also, it was important to at least get the ball rolling with this new government and to explain what India's objectives and aims in this region would be.
Right. Could I ask you a little bit about the Brunei side of the equation? You're someone who's covered maritime issues, maritime policy, and strategic policy with regard to countries like Indonesia for a very long time. Could I ask you about when you talk about Brunei, Narendra Modi as well as the Sultan of Brunei have talked about defense cooperation. We saw that National Security Advisor Ajit Doval was also in the room during these meetings. What exactly is the defense and strategic piece of the equation with a country like Brunei? It's of course very small, but as you were mentioning, there's also there are disputes in the South China Sea with regards to China. What exactly is the piece here, if you could explain, with defense? What can the two countries do together? What would India be interested in?
Think Brunei, it's a very small country, but currently the main dispute that it has never been out as much as you would hear. You would hear a lot about Vietnam, Philippines, disputed claims in the South China Sea, for example, because they are voicing it outright. Vietnam, yes, is keeping a hedging approach, but at the same time, it calls out China when the time is right. Philippines here has obviously taken the boldest approach till date when we look at ASEAN countries about the South China Sea dispute. Brunei is one of the claimant countries which has a dispute with China. Besides that, there are intra-ASEAN disputes, but in that they do not want the interference of any other external country. That they settle it within themselves at the platforms of ASEAN and stuff like that. And ASEAN has done well in that. When it comes to intra-ASEAN, that is within the ASEAN, if member countries have a dispute, they have done that well. They have settled that within themselves. In that, ASEAN has a good track record. But when it comes to South China Sea, Brunei, along with Cambodia and Laos, for example, has always, they have been difficult to come up to voice an opinion against China. For example, sometimes those has led to deadlocks when it comes to joint communique after an ASEAN meeting, for example. Given ASEAN goes by consensus approach, just as I said before, even if three countries or even if one country is not supporting what the others are saying, the decision gets deadlocked there. And Brunei has been also one of the countries which is very strongly, economically dependent on China and has not voiced their opinion against China. But now I would say things are changing a bit. When incidents with Philippines was happening, is continuing to happen. Sometimes you would see countries within ASEAN also coming out with statements, and Brunei has been also one of them. So that way, I think countries are realizing that disputes like this is affecting regional security in the region. And one more thing is, for example, Laos right now is also entering into a debt crisis because of the growing Chinese investments. So these are also sort of lessons for countries like Brunei, Cambodia, that there can be, they can also have a similar future. So that's why I think the opportunity is ripe at the moment for India to tap into these countries where India has not, explored much, in even within the Look East and the Act East domain policies, basically. In terms of defense cooperation, as I said, maritime cooperation would be very important at the moment. Capacity building, especially for navies like Brunei, because they have very limited capacity. Brunei's navy, I think, is the smallest when it comes to within Southeast Asia. So the capacity is extremely limited. So especially naval training, probably at least starting a coordinated patrol, or at least starting some coordinated exercises, getting their naval officers training in our naval war colleges, or even, at least providing them with patrol boats like we have done in the case of Vietnam, for example. These kind of initiatives and steps need to be taken, because right now the most glaring dispute that they have, which is of concern, is the South China Sea dispute.
Understood. So you've talked about the defense and strategic side. If I could also ask you a little bit about energy. Brunei, I think for most countries in the world, comes up, or at least acquires prominence, because of the massive exports of energy, whether you're talking about oil or natural gas that the country undertakes. It's basically energy exports that powered Brunei's rise to prominence, as well as its economic prosperity. It's among the richest countries in the world. Could I ask you a little bit about whether you see India also angling for a bit of the energy market with Brunei? Is that part of the equation when India looks at Brunei?
Yes, it will be because as even Minister Jaishankar keeps on saying that this is also the 10th year of the Act East policy, and I think that also has to go. That also probably explains all these line of visits, to Southeast Asian, also from Southeast Asian countries, officials or even heads of states to India, for example. But energy is an important area, especially green energy. There is a lot of talk in Southeast Asia, especially if we read statements by Dr. Jaishankar. He has clearly mentioned that green energy is an important area and is an untapped area which India wants to look into when cooperating with countries in Southeast Asia, especially like Singapore, Brunei, Malaysia, among others. So it is important, and it will be a topic of discussion probably. I think it was a topic of discussion as well. Food security would also be another topic of discussion when we are talking about countries like Brunei, for example. And there is also a lot of untapped, in the huge Indian diaspora, even in Brunei itself. So, in those regards, also people to people links would be an important area to look into. We have had, students from ASEAN countries coming to our engineering institutes, for example, but I don't think there has been much students coming from Brunei, for example. So, at least even starting these kind of collaborations and joint projects when it comes to green energy and energy security would be important for a small country like Brunei, which actually, you're right, depends on energy resources when it comes to exports of energy resources, and especially talking about renewable energy and stuff like that would be important when we are talking with countries like Brunei,
Understood. And
whose economies are extremely small.
right.
So depending on energy is one of their important facets, actually.
Understood. If I can ask you a little bit about, the Singapore side, where the Prime Minister is right now. He's expected to meet with Lawrence Wong, who's the Prime Minister of Singapore, as well as really the top leadership of Singapore. Semiconductors is something we've heard a lot about in regards to the conversation with Singapore. You mentioned a little bit about how Singapore was so important for India's Act East policy, and several people, I think, have alluded to that Singapore was the country that, when India initially came up with its look east policy, in the 1990s and so on and so forth, the idea was that Singapore was one of those countries that helped open up Southeast Asia to India, was very diplomatically helpful at that point in time. Could you talk a little bit about just a little bit of the strategic part of this relationship as well, but also on the tech side, what's going on with semiconductors, as well as how Singapore fits into this piece of the equation for India?
So, with regard to the strategic side, which I think, if we look at how India's Rookies policy has evolved, it has evolved in stages. There are certain countries with which India kicked off its, Rookies policy, and with which relations have been a first priority. Singapore is one of them. Singapore, Vietnam, these countries were very important in India's Lookies policy, stages. In the very first stage, in the very first phase of the Lookies policy in the 1990s, Singapore and Malaysia, Indonesia, these three countries were extremely important. After that, you can say, our focus went on to Vietnam, Myanmar, and later to Cambodia, Laos, and now to Brunei and Philippines. Philippines, we have had relations, but I think it's only in the past couple of years or in the past year that the relationship has elevated to the level it has elevated right now under Marcos Jr. But with Singapore, we have had steady relationship. And Singapore, given that it is the India coordinator right now, so our regular meetings have kept on happening, especially between the two foreign ministers. And Singapore, I would say, it was one of the very first countries also with which India started maritime exercises when it comes to Southeast Asia. The Simbex exercises, which started in 1994, it was just after the Lookies policy started. So even in those terms, when it comes to having a stepping stone even in the defense sector, Singapore was one of the one of the first countries with which India even initiated this kind of defense cooperation. So in that way, Singapore has basically, you can say, stood the test of time when it comes to the India bilateral relationship or even India's Lookies policy. And Singapore has a lot of Indian diaspora. Singapore has we have the largest FDI flows from Singapore also. If you track not only within ASEAN but even globally. And Singapore has, there is a lot of manufacturing. There has been talks about, increasing partnership when it comes to manufacturing sector as well. Singapore has drawn a lot of Indian talent, for example, from here. So in that way, Singapore has been an important partner. In the defense sector, I would say the focus has been mostly on naval and maritime exercises. But also, Singapore right now doesn't have much of security or defense concerns as, say, Vietnam, Philippines at the moment, or Indonesia at the moment, because Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, these have extremely large exclusive economic zones, which are facing a lot of challenges at the moment. So with Singapore, I think relations has been focused mostly on tech, trade, and investment, as well as industry partnerships. So maritime has been just one part of it, but I think mostly the relation has focused on tech, and right now it's moving to semiconductors. Digital payments, digital interface has been a very important thing which Singapore has advocated for. Food security is one. Next is tech, and as I said, trade and investment. These have been the main faces when it comes to India, Singapore, and people-to-people linkages. Strategic and defense has been there, but it has been surpassed by these other sectors that I just mentioned when it comes to the India-Singapore partnership, very honestly speaking.
Understood. Dr. Premesha Saha, thank you so much for joining us, explaining how Singapore and Brunei fit into India's policy, its broader Indo-Pacific vision, and why Prime Minister Narendra Modi has chosen to make this visit at this point in time. Thank you so much, Dr. Saha, again, and thank you again, dear viewers, for watching India Today Global.